I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation back over to Chris Chapman, who will demonstrate how to retrieve data from AQS.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, it took me a second to get unmuted there. Thanks that was great stuff, Michael, that you just shared. That was wonderful. And so I'm just going to talk very quickly about one of the basic functions of AQS, which is retrieving data. And this is something you can be in the read-only, you can be a read-only user and still do. And this is the facility that accesses Oracle reports that we talked about earlier. And so the way you access this is you go down from the menu, you click on retrieval and then standard report selection. We can go to the next slide. And then you'll be confronted with a form that looks like this. And this is the standard report criteria selection form. You will occasionally hear it referred to, not that you guys need enough more acronyms given what we've given you already, but it's the R31 form because it's used so much. And the first thing you do on it, there's 5 tabs across it, and the first one is you hit the report code and you go down to the report you want. As you can see, these reports also begin with AMP, and then they have a name. And the example we're going to show here is to extract raw data. Each of the reports has a different use case. In this case, what this one is used for a lot of times is if you put data into AQS and you want to delete it out, and there's a bunch of it, you can run this report and make the action indicator D, so it comes as delete, for the range of records you want. It can also be used to prepare upload files, like if there's a particular kind of raw data, maybe you have some data, just a few items that you entered last year and you're going to do it this year, and it's at the same place, and you're just going to need to change the date and the sample measurement, you can do that and then load it. So it basically, what this report basically does is it lets you take raw data that you put into the system out of the system in either that pipe delimited or XML format. So it basically gives you back the data you entered in a format you want. So okay, so let's choose the report and we can go to the next slide. And then for any report, there's going to be different, these fields will change depending on the report you run. This form is dynamic in that sense. Not every form is going to require a date range. Not every form will have the same geographic information. And in this case, Michael we're in tribal mode here, so we've entered the tribal code for the Ho-Chunk Nation, and we want to get the data for March 2020 for the 88101, which is one of the PMs. And I'm sorry, I don't have that memorized, but PM monitors. And so you'll enter in all the data you want. And one of the things I want to say about reports is you enter data across, like in a field, you're limiting it at, right? So it's an and. So in this case, it's the Ho-Chunk Nation, and it's this site, and it's this parameter code. But then as you add data, and then as you put in the date criteria, we'll also put in an and as well. So we're essentially what you're doing. I don't know if you guys here who's written SQL, but essentially this is putting more and more information in the where clause of an SQL statement in the end. And so in this case, right, we've covered the geographic stuff, and then also you're gonna limit the date criteria. So it's like, give me the 88101 measurements taken at this particular site for March of 2020. And so once you've gotten the criteria the way you want them, then you hit the generate report button, and we can go to the next slide. And then it will, we didn't show it, but on that form that we just looked at, the 5th tab is the report status, and it will tell you this report shouldn't take long to run. Some of the reports in AQS do take a long time to run, particularly some of the 256s, which are and the 251, the 600, the certification and QA related reports can take some time to run. So it is important sometimes when you run those reports that you're very specific and you only get the information you want. I think one of the things we run into, this is not usually caused by tribal users, but sometimes regional users will, run a big report for all the states in their region, and that will cause AQS to choke. That doesn't happen as often. We've made some performance improvements, and I think people are more aware of that. That's more a problem we had several years ago, but we would occasionally have times where people would submit a massive report and it would not be great for AQS, and then when it didn't run fast enough, they'd submit it again. But we've tried, as there's as we've encountered those, we try to optimize both the database and the individual reports, so there's less of that. But anyway, sorry. And so what will happen is, when it comes up, you'll hit the retrieve report button, which is on that form we just saw. And then in this case, it pulls down a zip file. The zip file has 2 pieces of information. It always has a PDF, which tells you the criteria you submitted, just as a reference, so you know what you did. And then you also then will get a text file. And in this case, you can see it spit out the values for this site, in the Ho-Chunk Nation, just the same way that whatever analyst, that air quality person that put this in, it comes out the same exact way. So you can see here's the 5 measurements I took for this parameter during March 2020. And we can go to the next slide. And the other thing is we've talked about with the pipe delimited format, and we didn't show it, but there's an option on this report to pull it back in XML if you're interested in that. But you can pull the pipe delimited stuff into Excel, and this is where we talked about, as an example, suppose you had you realize that you put the wrong method code on this. I'll just use that as an example. And there was a method code for the monitor, but then you realize, oh, it's not the right one. So you could edit out the method code here. You could change the action indicator to update, and then resubmit this file to AQS, and it will update all of those records. And that's the primary use of this 501 report. And I did want to talk about the most important thing on here is the action code or the action. The 2 most important things really are the kind of transaction it is, and this is a RD, so it's a raw data transaction, and then the action code, and that's always going to be an I, a D, or a U. I is for insert, D is for delete, and U is for update. So you insert records that aren't already in the database. You update records that are in the database with new information if needed. And then you delete records that are already in the database. And again, as we talked about AQS, tracking errors, if you try and update or delete data that's not already in the database, you'll get an error. And if you try and insert data that already is in the database, you'll get an error because say, wait, this is already here, you can't reinsert it. You can't update or delete it. And anyway, so we can go to the next slide if that's not clear. I know I tend to talk fast, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so we talked about transaction type, action indicator, usually for most transaction, and again, this is a bad example because the state code for a tribal, so this should say the state code or the TT code for tribal is usually the 3rd column, and then the county code or tribal code is usually the 4th column. Again, I want to emphasize if we've written state or county here, what we mean is the tribal indicator and the tribal code. So I'm sorry about that one. I should have caught that. And then the site ID is the 5th column, and that's the 4-digit thing we've talked about. And that's not true for every transaction. You can look at it, but in generally, it is true. So this is how raw data format works. And we can go to the next slide. And then, okay, and so there are also, so this is I'm just gonna take a second and talk about this. One of the things we've tried to do over the last several years is really make sure that, well, we've tried to do 2 things, right? Because there's kind of 2 broad communities of AQS users. There's the community of people that submit the data and are involved in air quality, management, who want to know, who are responsible for getting the data into AQS so that it can be used to make non-attainment decisions. So there's that sort of, I don't even know I guess I'll call them submitters for lack of a better word, which, the people running the monitors and then their management. So that's important. But then there's a whole universe of people who just want to know the air quality where they live, or I think the common example we often give, they're researchers, who want to trying to run health effects studies. So they want to see if, what's the ozone level here and what is it, somewhere else. And then I'm measuring some health, maybe I'm measuring emphysema rates or asthma rates and how can I correlate what's going on with that with the air quality. And so one of the things we tried to do as a broader team, AQS team, is make that data available in public formats that you don't have to register for. The Air Data website is one, and then we also have something called the API, which uses what's a format called REST and JSON, which is a much more modern way of getting data out. And there are links to where all this is. We have the AQI data too in there historically. And then the other thing is, here's the thing about the data that's given to us. And this is another point I always try and make when I have a chance to give a presentation. This data does not belong to us, the EPA. It belongs to the people that put it in. So the data that the state of North Carolina puts in belongs to the state of North Carolina. The data the Ho-Chunk Nation or another tribe puts in belongs to that tribe. And so there are two aspects of that. The first is we are very loath to ever change data. In fact, we never do it unless we have explicit permission from the entity that submitted it. And the cases there would be, if they loaded a year's worth of data and they're like, oh my God, we realized we loaded all this ozone data and we had the wrong method for it when we set up the monitoring network, and we need to change that. So that's something, very occasionally we can run a script behind the scenes. Although again, we always encourage and try and provide facilities for the individual users and individual, agencies, air monitoring agencies, tribal and other, to change that themselves. But that's really important. And then the second part of it is this data also belongs to the entire, American people. And so it is all FOIable, right? You can come to us any day and say, I want all the data in AQS. And so in order to facilitate that, we have pre-generated files of extracted AQS data. So if you want all the AQS data from 1977, we can give it to you in an easy way. And that's mainly, we put some of those facilities up just in case we do get FOIA requests or researchers will often want to get a bunch of data at once. And so that way they don't have to run a new report against the system. And especially for older data, which isn't going to change or shouldn't change, that's an easier way to do it than, if it's data from say, even like 2015, better for us to just give you this file of all the data we have for 2015 than have you run a report against the live database. And so we're trying to kind of build more resources to serve that community of people that are not actually data submitters and keeping AQS reserved for data submitters. But I would encourage you just to look at these facilities anyway. I think they're useful and they can oftentimes help you get data in a way. And the other thing, the last thing I'll say about this, I know we're running out of time, is that this used to be a system that was days or even a week behind AQS, but right now the database that supports air data and the API and the pre-generated files, that runs like at most a minute behind AQS. So unless it's data that, unless you have an urgent need for data you loaded in the last 5 minutes, you can get it from these sources just as easily, and it will be, almost, I can't call it real time, but it's virtually real time. And this can be useful, especially for managers or other folks that aren't AQS users but have a need for AQS data or other air quality data. So we've really expanded those efforts, and I always try and make some of those distinctions we talked about, and who owns the data, and some of the philosophies and procedures that guide the way we treat the data and try and make it available. And I think that's it for me. And I'm sorry for taking so much time and talking fast, but